mining pool that supports payouts to shielded addresses, only to public addresses, all of these rewards that go into the shielded pool have to come out at some point in some way to be able to be paid to the miners themselves of the mining pool. As such, we have identified two separate modes of payouts. The first one is a payout pattern that we will call pattern T payouts. In this mode, after the mining pool sends its coins to the shielded pool, then it converts back all of the coins at the same time to a fixed public address that is different from the original mining address, and then pays the miners from this specific address. The second mode we will call pattern Z. In pattern Z, what is different is that after the mining pool converts all the coins to a shielded address, they directly pay the miners from this shielded address, but as the miners only have public addresses, these transactions will actually appear on the chain as shielded addresses, Z to T addresses that reveal a lot of coins, and they don't have any public inputs, but have lots of public outputs on the other hand. But these two have to be somehow linked. As quickly, how do these transactions actually look in the chain? Well, on an actual Explorer, you would notice them like this, where, for example, if it's a pattern T payout, then in the transaction you have a single input, hundreds of outputs, and that's it. If it would be a pattern Z output, a pattern Z payout, then in that case, the difference would be that there's no input in the transaction, and it would also contain a ZK snark and the exact amount of coins revealed from the shielded pool as well. So now the question is, how do we actually link a mining pool to these payout transactions? Well, our core idea was that for every mining pool and every miner even, we know exactly how many coins they mined, and we know exactly how many coins they have hidden to the shielded pool. But we also know that they have to pay it out to the miners, to public addresses, which means that the same amount that goes into the mining pool has to come out, even if not in the same transaction, but in some way over the same amount of time, the same amount of coins have to be hidden and revealed by the mining pool. So if we can examine different time periods in the chain where we compare these two values, we can try to find this linkability. As such, we have developed two heuristics for the two different payout methods. First, pattern T payout methods are actually quite easy to find. Our heuristic is very simple. First, we choose a block period or a time period in the blockchain, and then in that period, we just simply sum up all the coins that every single address received from a shielded transaction into a public address. Then, all of these coins that were received by public addresses, we compare them to the coins that were hidden by every single mining pool, and we just look for direct matches of, or almost direct matches of values. Most of the time, we will actually have a unique link between a public T address and the miner. If we have multiple links, then we can investigate other block periods as well and try to find which one of the multiple links is the actual correct linkage. On the other hand, in pattern Z payouts, as I have said earlier, we have transactions that don't have any public inputs, but have lots of public outputs on the other hand. In this case, our heuristic is based on a sort of overlapping sets technique, where what we do is we choose again a fixed block period, and then in this fixed block period, we find a transaction that looks like a pattern T transaction, and we fix that as our starting transaction. After fixing that transaction, we say that this transaction now is a mining payout transaction, and all the addresses that have received coins in this transaction are the miners' addresses. Afterwards, in this fixed block period, we loop over every single other transaction and look for transactions where at least a certain threshold amount of the public addresses will be exactly the same in our first starting transaction. If we find such a transaction, then we take this transaction as a mining transaction, and we add all the new addresses to our miner set. And then for the next transaction, we now have a larger set that can overlap with the outputs. And then we just loop over this block period until we can't add any more transaction to this pool. Using these two techniques, we could actually link more than 88% of every single mining reward that has ever been issued. And in terms of volume of all the Z2T revealing volumes, in general in Zcash, we could link 84% of it. In terms of number of transactions, we could link more than 68% of the transactions with these techniques. And in general, if we consider regular T2T public transactions, then more than 95% of the transactions are completely linkable, which takes us close to the privacy level of Bitcoin even, which means that in general, shielded transactions are not used in a wide manner. And also, I know there has been already work on this topic, but our results in terms of revealing volume are almost 20% better than the earlier results. So now that we have actually these mining transactions, and we have the miners in the mining pools their specific addresses as well, we can try to figure out what is the mining hardware landscape. Before that, I have to mention a few small technical terms for mining, where, for example, a mining farm is usually a one-to-one translation between a specific miner address, and then a mining farm can consist of multiple rigs, where a rig is basically a piece of hardware. And then workers are actually separate than rigs, because workers are manually set up partitions of this farm, where a worker can be a single rig, but it can mean multiple mining rigs as well. So how did we gather our data for our study? Well, we have found that actually two large mining pools, namely Nanopool and Flypool, have completely public APIs. What that means that if we know the public address of a miner, then we can send an API request to the website and then get back a lot of information on that specific miner. Namely, we get back its recent hash rate, all of its miner names, and the mining hash rates per every single worker as well. After we gather this data for roughly 50,000 miners in Zcash over a 3-month time period, then in this database, we were interested in how the different hardware is distributed inside Zcash, namely how are the different GPUs are distributed inside Zcash. To do that, we just simply queried inside the worker names for the number code of GPU card. So for example, if we want to talk about the NVIDIA GTX 1060 card in the top right, for that, we just simply queried for the string 1060 and then plotted our results in these histograms. In the histogram itself, the x-axis is the solution rate of the worker, and the y-axis is how many workers we have seen with that much power. If we look at, again, for example, at the top right, at the GTX 1060 graph, then apart from the non-zero peak, the first peak is, again, coincidentally exactly the power of a single GTX 1060 card. Then if we see the second peak, that is exactly the power of 2 1060 cards. And then there's even a smaller peak around 850, 900 solutions per second, which is again the power of 3 GTX 1060 cards. We did this study for all the other cards that were used for equihash mining, but then something happened last May, which is 2 large ASIC manufacturers, namely InnoSilicon and Bitmain announced specific ASIC miners for the Equihash 209 algorithm. And then the first question that came to people inside Zcash was there any hidden ASIC mining inside Zcash, as in the same circumstances, in Monero, it is widely believed that there was a very sizable amount of hidden ASIC mining before even these ASIC manufacturers announced at all that they actually have this ASIC ready for the market. To try to figure out whether this actually happened in Zcash, we found an interesting metric, which we will call developer fees. What we found that for these GPU cards that were mining in Zcash, almost all of them were using closed source software written by developers, in which you didn't have to pay for the code itself, but to use the code, 2% of the time, this software was mining for the developer's address instead of the actual miner's specific address. So our method from here on was that if we can find the addresses of these developers, and then if, based on the payouts that we have earlier linked and figured out, if we can estimate the mining power of these addresses, then if we just simply multiply this mining power by 50, we can estimate roughly what is the GPU power, at least in Zcash. And this is exactly what we did in this graph. In this graph, the red top part is the part that we couldn't identify as connecting to any specific software. But the green graph on the top is the ratio between the overall Equihash mining power and the identified GPU mining power. And as you can see, it started out around 75–80%, then it dropped down to 60, but then in like the last half year before this announcement, it was very stable around this 75% degree, with which we argue that if there was any ASIC mining hidden in Zcash, it probably wasn't more than 25% of the overall mining power, which is hopefully good news. But after May, we know that now ASICs are actually introduced into Zcash, and we were also interested how did this graph change after the introduction of ASICs, which is this graph where you can see that from basically June until the end of October, the mining power have basically quadrupled, while the estimated GPU power have basically diminished to completely zero, which means that the mining power has completely changed from being GPU-based mining power to completely ASIC-based mining power. Another interesting effect of mining ASICs is usually in the community is how does introducing ASICs affect the centralization of a coin? We have investigated that as well and created the following metrics, which we will call miners per day. What does that mean is that from the payout transactions that we could identify, how many unique miners have received a reward on that specific day. And then we divided the result by mining power as well. What we found that before ASIC started to appear in the network, there was a quite stable number of miners, around 60,000. But as soon as ASICs were introduced, these number of miners started to drop extremely heavily to when finally stabilized around the 15,000 mark roughly, which also means that ASICs are usually quite unhealthy if you want your coin to be decentralized from a mining point of view as well. Finally, let me talk about individual miners as well. As I said, we can approximate the hash rate of a specific miner based on the payouts, which is actually quite simple. It's just a function of the time between payouts, the value of the payout, and the global hashing rate. And if we, based on just these three variables, we can guesstimate the mining power of a specific miner. And thus, every miner can be individually tracked by how much is their mining power. As such, first, we did a graph where we plotted every single mining power we have ever recorded in Zcash, which is this graph. And what we noticed in it, that it sort of looks like a combination of different normal distributions. After we tried to plot this curve as a combination of normal distribution, what we found was that all the means of these specific normal distributions are, again, coincidentally, exactly the mining power of the different rigs that are found in GPUs inside Zcash. And finally, let me talk about one more topic very quickly, which is the privacy of a single miner. On this graph, we have tracked a single randomly chosen miner's mining power just based on the payout value, the payout transaction, nothing else, not from the, we didn't look into the mining pool website or anything like that. And what we found, for example, in this case, is that this miner first started to have around 500 to 600 solutions per second mining rate, but at some point, at a very distinctive time, suddenly this mining power increased to around an 850, 900 solutions per second, which is, coincidentally, exactly a GTX 1060 card. So what we can say about this miner, that this miner has actually acquired, at that increase in mining power, at that exact time, this miner has acquired a GTX 1060 card. And even later on around that point, we can see that then it had to turn off for some reason this card and then turn it back on again as extra information from us. And any kind of sensitive information like this could violate the privacy of a miner specifically. So as countermeasures for these, we had a few suggestions. First is, if you increase your payout threshold in a mining pool, then our estimation of your mining power will be much less accurate. Also, if you frequently change your addresses and these addresses can't be clustered together, then we say that that's a relatively secure way of doing it as well. And if your mining pool supports shielded addresses for payouts, then obviously use those. But what we found that it's still only Fly pool is the only place where you can actually mine to a shielded address. As a last note of what we use to do all of these studies in the blockchain, well, there is a Bitcoin high-performance tool called BlockSci, which we have modified and specialized for Zcash, that it can handle shielded transactions, both Sprout and sapling transactions, and it creates a Python library, and using that Python library to cycle through roughly 4 million transactions and do some simple calculations with each one of them took roughly 6.5 seconds on a regular PC. And the tool itself is available on our GitHub page on the link. So to summarize very quickly, we showed that mining pools are the main users of shielded transactions, and we have developed heuristics that can tag these mining pool transactions very well. And we have also shown that basically miners, even if you mine in Zcash, you have the same privacy as if you would be mining for Bitcoin, for example. And finally, as a general note, as we probably all know, that mixing public and shielded transactions in general is, in a privacy-oriented currency, is not usually a very good idea. Thank you. If you have any questions, we have a few minutes.
Okay, great. So my question is basically, if we know that all the miners are mostly moved on to ASICs. And we know that using ASICs has pretty high capital requirements. So there's some degree of re-centralization there. And we know that there's also not really much privacy available to miners for all the reasons that you gave in your talk. Like, wouldn't it be maybe worth considering just like cutting out the middleman of all the wasted electricity and like just abandoning mining?
I mean, of course, but then give me a good solution that works right now in any currency to replace proof-of-work mining. Like in the future, of course, lots of people are working on different consensus mechanisms to replace proof-of-work, but right now, today, there's not much anything else that we could use right now. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Hello, thanks for sharing these results and doing the research. So I'm curious about the analysis of the fall off in the number of miners with the introduction of ASICs. Does the y-axis correspond to what you were calling workers? So
no, those are individual miners. So those are not the workers. So workers are the parts inside a miner. Okay. That on the blockchain itself, we don't see the workers themselves separately. The workers are on like the mining pool website where you can monitor parts of your farm to see that, oh, one of my workers is offline right now. I should go to my hardware and restart it, for example, or something like that.
So do those correspond with like individual accounts at the mining pool when you're using the APIs to look up information? My question is kind of, is that number an upper bound on the number of organizations or individuals, or is it close?
Kind of, you could say that, yeah. I mean, so it is probably more how many are mining, because it can be that you have such a high threshold, for example, that you don't receive payout every single day, for example, but it's a good estimation of like how these changes in general. And that drop in number of miners was actually not only the effect of ASICs as well, but that's where